Welcome to What is Going for new thought from the edge of Each week on Times flagship radio show, veteran broadcaster, author, and media consultant Sandie Sedgbeer conducts thought-provoking interviews with inspirational authors, artists, musicians, scientists, speakers, and filmmakers who are working at the point where spirituality and science meet consciousness at the very edge of Here is your host, Sandie Sedgbeer.
Hello. Over the last 3 years, we've aired several conversations with former minister, researcher, speaker, and best-selling author Paul Anthony Wallis, based on his Eden trilogy of books. For those of you who didn't catch those episodes, Paul Wallis is a senior churchman who served as a church doctor, a theological educator, and an archdeacon in the Anglican Church in Australia. He's the author of numerous titles on Christian mysticism and spirituality. Paul's work probes the world's mythologies for their insights into human origins and human potential. And Paul joins us again today to continue the conversation with revelations from his fourth book in this series, The Eden Conspiracy, Ancient Memories of ET Contact and the Bible Before God. Paul Wallis, welcome back.
G'day, Sandie. It's great to be with you again.
You too. So, as revealed in the first 3 books in your Eden series, you believe the Bible is a narrative of paleo contact, a collection of ancestral memories from a time when Earth was colonized and human beings were governed by extraterrestrial beings. In your latest book, and this is the Eden Conspiracy, you are talking about you address many critical questions and a lot of anomalies, and the book is absolutely fascinating. We're not going to have time to go through much of it today, but I think what we should be focusing on are 3, actually probably 6 critical questions, including: what were the world's ancestral stories before they became viewed as fiction and fable? What was the Bible before it became a book about God? A novel about God, perhaps we should say. And another question: if the Bible was not about God, what was it that our ancestors wanted us to know? So let's start with those, and then we'll add in a few more as we go along.
For sure. Well, in the first 3 in the Eden series, I probably established for the reader that many of the stories that we think of as God stories from the Bible were very probably something else in the beginning. And part of my role as a theological educator was to teach pastors hermeneutics. That's how to interpret ancient texts. And very often we'd have to approach a text with the question: is this the original version of the story, or is it an adaptation of an even earlier version? And it was really that kind of investigation that led me to the ancient texts from out of ancient Sumeria, Babylonia, Arcadia, and Assyria. And I learned that many of the Elohim stories and the Yahweh stories of the Bible are really stories of the sky people in the Mesopotamian literature, and that we've got the summary form in the Bible. And those words, Elohim and Yahweh, are 2 of the words that Bible translators have interpreted as God. But as I show in the Eden series, that's not the original meaning of those words. Elohim originally means the powerful ones, and Yahweh, well, it's actually a word without a meaning, and we'll probably come back to that a little bit later, but it certainly doesn't indicate what you and I would understand by the word God. And in fact, if I use the word God today, most people will think, oh yes, that means a transcendent, supernatural, spiritual being, the source of the cosmos. Well, as it happens, there isn't a word for that in the Hebrew language. So the stories are not about that. And so in the Eden Conspiracy, I asked the question, well, if the stories were not God's stories, what was the whole thing about? If it wasn't there to teach monotheism, what were those stories intended to teach in the beginning? And I peel back the layers and find there's a very rich education that's been bequeathed to us by the Hebrew scribes. An education about social progress, about human origins, about people power, about the persistence of old powers, about the dangers of covert government, about human potential, layer after layer of very rich education, which all disappears the moment you interpret those as God stories. And the moment you do that, it all becomes about sin and obedience, worship, punishment, right and wrong, good and bad, and you do the right thing. It's all about compliance. And we lose the richness of the original education intended for us.
But, you know, as you quote often, it's all there. The clues are all there. The information is all there. People just haven't seen it. Isn't it also true that there are many indigenous peoples who have no word for God? None at all.
Yes, that's right. We think that the idea of God that I've just given is a universal, and it isn't. And where does that put us if we're suddenly in a universe where the idea of God we've grown up with is actually absent, or if the idea we've grown up isn't rooted in anything? And I really had to make that reframing for myself. As I went through this research, it shifted my understanding of what God might be or what God might mean. And I had to realize that the sort of Father Christmas image that I had, or the puppet master image that I had, wasn't rooted in anything other than cultural habit. And I had to dig a bit deeper and ask, well, what did the ancients who did use this word, say the Greeks who used the word theos, what did they mean by it? And then how do we find our place in a cosmos that doesn't have a God concept in it?
Yeah. It must have been an incredible experience for you with your background. I mean, such a mind shift that you had to make there.
It was a mind shift, but it really was piece by piece. And I was very fortunate that when I came to faith as a teenager, one of the key pieces of the puzzle for me was realizing that the credibility of Jesus and the credibility of religious institutions are two completely separate questions. And it was only once I'd separated those out that I could really make a positive assessment or a positive decision around Jesus and what I was going to do with his story. So it helped me that I started off with this askance look at the inherited traditions of Christianity. And then another thing that really helped me very early in my journey as a Christian believer was I went to a church with two fabulous pastors, David Pitches and Barry Kissel, both of whom have now passed away. They were wonderful leaders. They led the church together. David Pitches was a bishop. Barry Kissel was the assistant minister. And after I'd been a believer for a few months, I realized they disagreed about something I thought was a really important doctrinal issue, infant baptism or something like that. And I talked to David about it, and he said, yes, so we think different things about that. And suddenly I realized, oh, okay, so this Christianity thing isn't that I sign up to 12 conclusions that are set in stone. I have to keep thinking. They can't both be right. So clearly, being a believer is about seeking the truth, finding out what's what. And it was a wonderful permission giver for me right in the early days. Also, another little seed had been sown by Eric von Daniken, these books I'd read when I was 11 years old. And I knew that there were some big questions that were really left unanswered by the Christian mainstream and left unanswered by the scientific mainstream. And his suggestion that our development as a species makes better sense if you allow for the possibility of external intelligent interventions, that just sat with me for decades, really, waiting for me to go back to the ancient texts to find out what really is going on there.
Yeah. So let's have a look at question number 4. I mean, why was this information, a lot of this information, edited and translated out of the Bible? And who did that?
Well, so first of all, if we accept that the Bible has these, what I call paleo-contact stories in them, so that's stories of ET contact in the beginning in ancient times. If we accept that originally we've got those stories there, yes, how did they get forgotten? Or how do they remain in the text and we don't notice them? And the answer really is that Judaism was very deliberately reformed from a canon of paleo-contact to a canon of monotheism. And that happened in the 8th to 6th centuries BCE. And I'm not saying anything controversial at all when I say that the current form of the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, took its shape at that time when a whole library of ancient texts and stories were edited and redacted to be turned into a seamless narrative of God and monotheism from beginning to end. They weren't that before, but they were now going to be rewritten to teach monotheism. Now, what I've just said, that's mainstream. You can go to any theological college anywhere, they will tell you that, and you can do the maths. The Bible actually records that change, and it tells us who made the changes and why. And there's a key figure in the story, King Hezekiah. Now, he is a king who has inherited his authority from a being called Yahweh. And we'll perhaps come back later to why I believe Yahweh was a being, a non-human being that governed over the tribes of Israel in the deep past. And once the tribes of Israel had progressed to the point where they didn't want to be governed by non-human anymore, they wanted human leadership for human society, they got rid of Yahweh, but Yahweh appointed a sequence of successors who became the kings. Hezekiah was one of those, so he was a Yahwist. That was his old raison d'etre, to serve Yahweh or honor the memory of Yahweh and to govern in the way Yahweh did, which essentially was through violence. And he came to the conclusion that if he worshipped Yahweh, everyone in his kingdom should as well. He had a high priest who was a Yahwist, Hilkiah, and of course Hilkiah said, very good idea, sire. I completely agree, because what that meant for him was getting rid of all the other priesthoods. So if you get rid of all the non-Yahwist priesthoods, there's only one news agency. Now you've got total narrative control. And so whereas kings like Solomon had set up priesthoods to Chemosh, Milcom, Baal, Dagon, Asherah, and Yahweh, now Hezekiah says, all those have got to go. We're going to demolish the temples, get rid of those priesthoods, knock down the standing stones commemorating the places where our ancestors met those beings, obliterate the memory of them. In fact, we need to go into the Jerusalem temple as well, because we've got carvings of all these beings there as well. We've also got a depiction of what Yahweh looked like. Get rid of that because he looks rather scary. We're wanting to rebrand him as God Almighty. And so there's this massive ritual reform across Judea. One of the most prolifically venerated figures was Asherah. And there were figurines of Asherah in every household, but they had to be confiscated and the heads broken off so they could never be used again. So that's Hezekiah initiating this great ritual reform. And then a couple of generations later, his grandson, Josiah, decides there should be a reform of the narrative as well, a reform of the scriptures. And so, assisted by the royal scribe Shaphan, and still the high priest's influences there, Hilkiah, they rewrite the scriptures, turn it into a book of the laws of Yahweh, which explains why everyone has to obey the king, why the king is there on Yahweh's behalf, why we follow Yahweh's laws, and why we demonize everybody else. By the time those two processes were complete, the ritual reform and the reform of the scriptures, Judaism had become a narrative that came from HQ. Now you had one God, that's Yahweh, forget all the others, one king, the Yahwist king, one high priest, the Yahwist priest, one temple, the one in Jerusalem, and all the tithes coming to that temple instead of scattered throughout the kingdom. So it's been a massive power grab of wealth and a power grab in terms of narrative control. So now that king can have a neatly ordered theocratic society, one God, one king, one temple, one tax system, one tithe system, it's what any government would want, a society that's easily managed, and he can do it in the name of God. And because he's picked a violent God, it justifies any force he wants to use to maintain control or get other people's lands. So that's why the redaction was made. That's why the Hebrew scriptures have taken the form that they have, except that the earlier stories are still visible. So if you go to a book like Jeremiah, Jeremiah still tells us that on every high hill and under every green tree, from every garrison city to every fortified town, there were installations to Asherah, and that the people loved Asherah and commemorated her with thanksgiving at every harvest festival. And they remembered Yahweh as a very negative experience in their past. They didn't live by his laws anymore, and they certainly didn't worship him. Jeremiah tells us all that. And so you might say, well, how on earth can you come away with Yahwist monotheism if Jeremiah is telling us that? And the answer is that he adds a little sentence giving his opinion of that. He'll say, on every high hill, under every green tree, people loved Asherah. Here's the sentence: isn't that awful? Isn't that idolatrous? And so the moment the narrator says that, you think, oh, yeah, oh, yes, how awful. But if you can separate the narrator's opinion from the narrator's information, yes, you realize there may be a difference between what the narrator's just said and what the author has just told you. The narrator would want you to forget Asherah ever existed. The author is guaranteed you'll never forget, because there it is in the text. It's just a matter of moving beyond the narrator's opinion and asking yourself, sorry, what did he just say?
So who was Asherah? I was looking her up earlier, and what I found on Wikipedia was that a lot of scholars associate her with Eve. So it looks as though people have been trying to reposition her in some ways, you know, move her around. She's a mother goddess. And it also says that there's further speculation that the Shekinah, as a feminine aspect of Yahweh, may be a cultural memory or devolution of Asherah.
Well, Asherah originally was remembered as an advanced being who came and tutored the ancestors of the Hebrew people in the secrets of agronomy. She is basically the Hebrew version of Hathor, Venus, Astarte. There are figures around the world like Mbabwana Warisa in the Zulu tradition, Hunhunapu in the Mesoamerican tradition. These female figures who are credited with visiting us in the deep past and giving us all the tools with which to become a civilization. And that's rooted in agronomy. So that's knowing which plants are good for eating, which are good to avoid, which are good for medicines, which are good for higher consciousness, and then how you cultivate them. Because as soon as you can cultivate them, you'll have surpluses, and then you'll have a specialized society, and then you can start building cities and become a civilization. That is what Asherah was commemorated for, with these equivalent figures all around the world. That's why at the harvest festivals is Asherah they were giving thanks to, because without Asherah, no harvest. And the persistence of the cult of Asherah is really something to be wondered at. I mean, clearly the kings intended for her memory to be extinguished by the 6th century BCE. And yet you go throughout Eastern Europe, if you find an olive tree in a church courtyard in an Orthodox church, that's the cult of Asherah right there, continuing covertly. I went to Brazil in the 1980s, and I went to a beautiful place in Pernambuco called Pesqueira, and they were having a harvest festival. And I thought I understood what I was seeing. I thought I was watching a Catholic ceremony. We'd had harvest festivals when I was a boy in England, and I thought I knew what it was about. You bring a can of food along to school and you sing some hymns thanking God for the harvest, and then the can goes to people who don't have enough. Isn't that what we're doing here? No. Thankfully, I had a local guide who explained to me that this festival was not a Catholic festival at all. It was the commemoration of the Queen of Heaven, who came and taught our ancestors how to grow corn. Well, this confused me because the Queen of Heaven is the Roman Catholic Church's title for Mary. But I was thinking, but Mary wasn't in Brazil thousands of years ago giving lessons in agricultural science. And it took me years to work out. I was being told this is nothing to do with Mary. The Queen of Heaven is somebody else. The Queen of Heaven was a title given to Asherah in the deep past. And the ceremonies I was watching in Brazil were exactly the same ceremonies, handheld figurines of a female entity who came and taught agronomy. It's the same thing. And finally, I could understand why Pope John Paul II was trying to stamp out all these harvest festivals, because they were really celebrations of paleo contact in the 1980s. How is it that this memory has survived from before the 6th century BCE, before the 8th century BCE? It's still the same memory, the same festival in the 1980s, and still authorities are trying to stamp it out. Back in the day, it was the Jerusalem Guard trying to confiscate those figures. In the 1980s, it was the forces of John Paul II. And that was one of the things that got me onto this trail of asking, well, what is this memory? Why do so many cultures tell the same story of this kind of intervention? And when did it happen? How ancient is it? And then why should our educational authorities, our governments, our mass media be so frightened of the story that they want to distort it and contort it or have us forget about it completely? When I learned about the Bible in school in Great Britain, the name Asherah was never mentioned. And centuries of translators working on the Bible have tried to turn Asherah into nothing more than a devotional object, when it's quite clear, if you read it slowly enough, she was a powerful being.
And you write in the book that excavations have revealed a 3-meter high standing stone, which indicates a place of paleo contact. And right there, you've got all kinds of, symbology and that point to Asherah and that point to the Pleiades and that point to so many other things that you think it is people think it is a portal.
That's right. Well, the standing stones are throughout the world, really, and many cultures are quite explicit about what they mean, that they're marking the place of contact with advanced beings. So the ancient Hebrews did exactly the same. I mean, an example of that would be the story of Jacob's ladder. After Jacob has his encounter with powerful beings arriving from space, through what looks like a portal, and then going back up into space through the same portal, he erects a standing stone and renames the place Bethel, the home of the powerful beings. So we know that this is what a standing stone means in the Hebrew tradition, and you can go to Tel Arad, Tel El Farah, you'll find standing stones there, and at Tel El Farah, we're given clues as to who the beings were that were encountered, because you've got, as you rightly said, Sandie, there are many symbols pointing to Asherah. So symbols of women baking bread cakes, that's an Asherah festival right there. And then there's this little object called a naus, which is a doorway with no building, a doorway with nothing behind it. And yet somehow an advanced being, Asherah, and we know it's her because of the inverted palm trees either side of the doorway, can step through that doorway. Now, you and I have a word for that. We would call it a portal. But the mainstream explanation of this object, which is called a naus, this magical doorway, is that it represents a building, that we should consider that a temple is implied. But if we just go with what's right in front of us and say there's a doorway that leads to nowhere, and beings can come from outer space through that doorway, yes, that's a portal. And the little cluster of stars above the doorway is a little star map telling us where the being Asherah came from before she turned up here. And just as you say, Sandie, it's the stars of the Pleiades, and those stars are associated with exactly this kind of intervention all around the world. So you can go from the Levant to Australia and find indigenous stories saying our helpers came from the Pleiades. You can go to North America, sit at the feet of Cherokee elders. They will tell you the same. When we learned the secrets of agronomy, it was visitors from the Pleiades who taught us these things. And for me, it's these correlations that really grabbed my attention and made me think there is real cultural memory being curated by these diverse and interesting stories all around the world.
So is Yahweh not a fan of Asherah, to put it politely?
No, Yahweh was not a fan of Asherah. I believe they actually belong to quite different time periods. So I know it's become a little bit popular in some circles to suggest that they were a couple or they were counterpart figures. But I think Asherah refers to interventions way back, prior to 60,000 years ago. And I think Yahweh is much more recent, and he didn't like having any competition. So the idea that this ancient commemoration is persisting when he wants to be the one and only, which is there in the Ten Commandments. You can't have any other powerful ones that you're honoring, and you shouldn't even be depicting them. Just me, Yahweh, that's the story. And we're told that he couldn't stand the honoring of Asherah, wanted it blotted out, and wanted people punished very strictly who were persisting with the old ways. And in fact, just to show the seriousness of this, if you go to the book of Ezekiel, in Ezekiel, a spokesperson turns up for Yahweh and says Yahweh is very displeased by this. He's very unhappy. There are still carvings of the Tseva Hashemayim in the Jerusalem temple. That's all the sky armies and the diverse beings who comprised it. And he said, we're going to do some ethnic cleansing here. Any family not willing to come into the public square and show open grief at the presence of these carvings is going to be killed. And we're going to use these devices. And he presented Ezekiel with the Kedi Mapaso and the Kedi Mashato. These translate as the shattering thing and the disintegrating thing. And apparently 6 individuals equipped with one of those can ethnically cleanse an entire district. So that's how much it mattered to Yahweh that these other figures were remembered. He would actually go and do ethnic cleansing to obliterate their memory. So that's a rather violent aspect to this ritual reform, as we might politely call it, that's spelled out for us in the Bible. And I think one of the amazing things, and I love shining a light on this in the Eden Conspiracy, is that the Bible is totally open about this change. The Bible tells us that Judaism used to be a memory of paleo contact and that it was turned into Yahwist monotheism. It tells us who did it, why they did it, when they did it, who the key players were: Hilkiah, Shaphan, Josiah, Hezekiah, Ezra. It tells us when it was done. So really, if you read the Bible slowly enough, you can't miss the fact that there's been a narrative change and how that narrative control was affected. And at times it was done through violence.
Yeah. And very advanced weapons.
And very advanced weapons, yes.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a short break now. You're listening to What Is Going On. I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, and my guest today is researcher, speaker, and former minister and author Paul Anthony Wallis. And we're discussing the 4th book in his best-selling Eden series, The Eden Conspiracy, Ancient Memories of ET Contact and the Bible Before God. We'll be back with more from Paul Anthony Wallis in a few moments.
Om Times TV. Imagine becoming a super influencer. Reinvent yourself. Invest in your brand and then manifest your success with a robust spheric approach. Om Times Media and Broadcasting offers a unique and multifaceted way to become the spiritual and conscious influencer you deserve to be by putting your message across our powerful platform with its proven record of integrity and excellence. Through our produced shows, Om Times offers the opportunity to become a social media TV personality, a radio show host, an Om Times magazine columnist, and a syndicated podcaster, all in one shot. By live streaming your show on Om Times TV and broadcasting it across the extensive Om Times radio and TV networks, you become more than a host. You become an ambassador and a force for positive change. Om Times. Open yourself to the possibilities.
Hello, I'm Sandie Sedgbeer, host of Om Times' flagship radio show, What Is Going On? And as an author, editor and 13 times book judge who's read thousands of books and interviewed hundreds of authors, I'm constantly asked what's really worth reading and what's not. So I created the No BS Spiritual Book Club to help you save time and money by picking the brains of discerning names who've walked this path before you. There's no catch, no fees and no BS, just an ever-growing library of 10 best spiritual book lists from some of your favourite authors and teachers, plus free book excerpts, audios and video interviews with people like Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., David G., Lee Harris, Mark Nepo and more. From well-known classics to hidden gems you've never heard of, it's the only no BS guide to the best spiritual books to enlighten your journey of self-discovery. So why not join the club? Get inspired and save money at the nobsspiritualbookclub.com.
There are 16 million children struggling with hunger in America. That's 1 in 5 daughters, sons, neighbors, and classmates who don't know where their next meal is coming from. Yet billions of pounds of good food go to waste every year. It's time we do something about it. Feeding America is a nationwide network of food banks that helps provide meals to millions of kids and families in need. Visit feedingamerica.org to help them feed even more. Together, we can solve hunger. Together, we're feeding America.
Welcome back. Paul Wallis, you met Brigadier General Haim, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, Eshed, Israel's former chief of space security, didn't you?
Well, I would love to have met him, and I'm glad that scene is that vivid in the book. But in The Eden Conspiracy, I take the reader into the meeting that Haim Eshed had with the journalists from Yediot Aharonot, which is the Israeli newspaper. And we sit at his feet as he gave his statement just before Christmas 2020. And I tell it that way because I want to slow it right down second by second so we can really get the import of what he was telling us. Now, in case people don't know, Brigadier General Haim Eshed was for 28 years Israel's chief of space security. So a very credible person, a professor. It was his job to know, moment by moment, if there was any kind of an ET presence or threat to our planet. That was his job. And Christmas 2020, he steps up to the mic, he speaks to Yediot Aharonot, and he says that on the basis of 28 years of privileged information, his understanding is that we have been in contact with ET visitors for more than 7 decades at a covert government level. And he gets quite specific which governments, the USA and Israel. And then he says, because he doesn't have authority to go beyond that, there may be other national governments around the world who have a covert representation in conversations with the Galactic Council. This is the phrase he uses. And that agreements have been made, collaborations are underway, that we have access to their technology, which is interstellar technology, and that we've agreed to their program of research in and around planet Earth. And again, he gets specific. He means on Earth and on Mars. So this is an incredible statement. And if anyone else had said it, you would think it's been fascinating. Do you have a doctor that I could speak to? But this is a very credible person. It was his job to know about these things. You couldn't have someone with access to more privileged information than Hermeshed. And it's because of who he is that we have to stop and say, wait, what did he just say? And when he says in contact, covert government level, more than 7 decades, a lot of people will say, well, yes, I'd sort of guessed that. I'd more or less worked that out. But the time frame he gives is very interesting, because that takes us back to the time when mass sightings began happening at an incredible rate, a rate we had never seen before. And I'm talking about the 1940s, after the detonations of the atomic bomb over Trinity, and then the obliteration of Nagasaki and Hiroshima. It was following those detonations that our skies were suddenly full of UFOs. And we're talking about the presidential administration of Harry Truman. Now, what's interesting about Hermeshed naming that time frame is that it's been a matter of urban legend for many decades that Truman and Eisenhower knew about ET contact and were involved in conversations with said Galactic Federation or Galactic Council. Hermeshed has more or less authenticated those stories. He is saying, yes, those were the administrations at the beginning of this iteration of contact. And then he gets very specific that there are ongoing implications of the decisions made then. And it's not going to stay this way forever, that our visitors are waiting for us to become a spacefaring civilization. The moment we do that, that's when we have a seat at that council. That's when we become neighbors rather than the studied or the abducted or the examined. But they're just waiting for humanity to reach that place of maturity. And the phrase Hermeshed used was, when we, you and I, have a better understanding of what space is and what spaceships are. So he's basically saying there's a technological bar we have to reach, and the policy of non-disclosure is being defined by our visitors, who are saying they're not going to self-disclose until that happens. But it's also being defined by what Americans refer to as the program. That's the Pentagon's program for reverse engineering materials retrieved from UFO retrievals. Once we've worked out how we can make one of those things that can ping in and out of visible airspace, once we've mastered space-time so that we can zip from one part of the cosmos to another, that's when everything changes. Hermeshed is saying we're a lot closer to that than you might think.
Yeah. Well, the obvious question is benevolence and malevolence here. And you do talk about various sightings around nuclear reactors, etc., that were of a benevolent nature. It sounds like they were trying to, stabilize things that were going on, trying to prevent certain things from happening. But at the same time, there's an awful lot in the book that is about the more malevolent side, Yahweh's imprint, if you like, with certain warnings in the Bible. And I mean, there's one in particular that I wanted to quote. Is it Micaiah? 1 Kings 22, when he said something about the divide and conquer politics of the Sky Council forewarns future generations of the possibility of our world leaders being managed and deceived by inscrutable powers, etc.
Yes, it's an old story. I'm very interested by the work of Robert Kirk in the 1600s, who was a Presbyterian minister in Aberfoyle, Scotland. And anyone who knows anything about religious history knows I've just described a very conservative person in a very conservative time, and yet on the basis of his study of the local experience, he came to the conclusion that there is a non-human layer, in the governance of Project Earth, and that it is management by a cadre of beings who don't have much fellow feeling with humanity, and that you can recognize their influence when you can spot governments behaving in a way with total disregard to the welfare of ordinary human beings. And that's the story around Micaiah as well, that you've got this, well, Hayam calls it a galactic federation. It's called the El Ba'adat in the Bible, the Council of the Powers. And the powers are not human. The powers are a spectrum of beings. So you've got flesh and bone beings on that council, but then you've got other beings that appear to be energy-based, archonic, parasitic kind of entities. And when Micaiah remote views the Sky Council, the Council of Power, he says, what I can see is there's this energy-based being up there saying, I think I can deceive nation A into invading nation B purely on false intelligence. And they say, oh, that sounds like a good idea, go for it. And so that's what he does. That's what the Sky Council does most of the time, foments wars. And that's just one example. Now, there's a warning there. It's still happening, that's right. I mean, there is a warning that it is possible that we can be manipulated into such a mentality of hostility and paranoia and aggression that we can be manipulated into invading someone else's country on false intelligence, on nothing stronger than that. Well, goodness me, if that isn't a lens by which to understand current realities, I don't know what is. And there are many stories like that where I think our ancestors, not just telling us about what happened in their day, they want us to be forewarned and forearmed against similar things happening in our day.
Yeah. You also talk about, ancient objects, relics, things that people value and treasure. And we hear a lot of stories about invasions of certain countries, especially in the Middle East, and people removing a lot of artifacts from them, ancient artifacts, artifacts that have vested with some kind of special power or be, believed to have a special power that other nationalities want to, appropriate.
Yes. Oh, that's goodness me, we could do an hour just on that, because there's such a range of interesting objects that powers want to get their hands on. And so if we think about the incursion into Iraq in 2003, there were some archaeological layers to that incursion. So on the one hand, we had Jörg Fassbinder's mission to retrieve the body of Gilgamesh, because he'd identified the sarcophagus of Gilgamesh. The significance of that was we could fact test the ancient Sumerian stories and find out if they were history or if they were just fiction, because Gilgamesh was supposedly a very, very tall, gigantic hybrid being. So you've only got to find the sarcophagus to begin testing that. So that was one thing. Another thing was, if we listen to the ancient texts of the Bible and the Sumerian stories and take them seriously, we would want to be in Iraq to see if there are any vestiges of Stargate technology. So you'd want your hands on those things for two reasons. One, for narrative control and information, and the other for access to advanced technology. But then there are other objects that are important because of what they represent. So I mentioned Hezekiah, for instance, earlier, and he was an inheritor of Yahweh's authority. So back in the day, this non-human entity had power to govern. Hezekiah wanted to present himself as Yahweh's proper successor, and so he would need Yahweh's objects. And so that's why in the Jerusalem temple, they had the bronze representation of Yahweh that Yahweh himself had commissioned. That's why they had the stones of the 10 Commandments, the tablets. That's why they had Moses and Aaron's rod. They were all put in the Ark of the Covenant. They represented the power of Yahweh. And for Hezekiah, if he had those objects, that meant he had the power to govern in Yahweh's name. Now, you might listen to that and think, funny old ancient people, what curious ways they had. Except if you'd paid attention to the coronation of King Charles III, you'll realize exactly the same thing is happening right now. You remember I mentioned those standing stones that Jacob erected in Bethel? So Jacob, the great patriarch, erects these standing stones to say, I had contact with the powerful ones here. Those stones became part of an altar, became part of a temple, and that represented the connection of the Hebrew leaders with the heavenly leaders. A portion of that installation was under the chair on which King Charles was crowned. That's the Stone of Scone. It was used to crown kings all around the world because it represented that connection with heavenly authority. And so it was there in the Middle East, it was in Spain, it was in Ireland, it was in Scotland, and then in 1196, the English stole it because they wanted their kings to be crowned above that stone. And England and Scotland now have a different arrangement. The stone can live in Scotland, that's our concession, but we'll still have it back for the coronations because that's Charles's right to govern over Scotland. If that stone isn't there, he doesn't have authority to govern over Scotland. That's the idea, that's the belief. And so even now in the 21st century, we have kings who are tying their right to rule with authorities from outer space. Goes all the way back to that story of Jacob in Bethel.
Well, if we take that back to kind of medieval times, everybody believed that the kings were ordained by God, not by, somebody else from another planet, but by God. And if they were ordained by God, they had absolute authority.
That's right. And obeying the king was the same as obeying God. You couldn't obey God and disobey the king. So you can see what a useful belief it is. But I think the devotion to the Stone of Scone shows that it goes beyond that. It's not just a device to get people to meekly pay, pray, and obey. The royals actually take this very, very seriously.
Yes, you have a wonderful section on crown power and covert government. And I read things in there that, I've never known as a Brit, and I'm sure most people in England do not know about certain exemptions from legislation,
Yes.
governing animal welfare, taxes, workers' rights, ownership of property in Australia that the Crown has kept.
Yes, I mean, Britain has been trying to become a democracy for 800 years. But there's a passage in the Bible. This is why I say the Bible has a very rich education once we read the stories in their original form. And you go to the story where the tribes of Israel sack Yahweh, and there's some very subtle lessons there about the persistence of old powers. They sack Yahweh because they want one of their own, a human being, to govern over them. So he disappears off, except it turns out he's still pulling strings from behind closed doors. He's actually appointing his first couple of successors. And then all the kings who come after that, if they depart from what Yahweh wants, there are going to be consequences, even though Yahweh has supposedly been sacked and isn't living on planet Earth anymore. So there's a very profound warning about the persistence of old powers. And in Britain, I mean, the struggle to become a democracy, you could trace it back to the Magna Carta in 1215. And then you had a revolution in the 1600s where the office of king was abolished and the office holder was executed. And then you had the Glorious Revolution of the 1680s, giving all the old crown powers to Parliament, and Britain was a republic for 15 years. And then we had the democratic reforms that allowed people to vote governments in. So it wasn't just the barons anymore. It was any landowner could vote. By the time you're in the 20th century, every man and woman can vote. We had world wars. We had the labor movement, so that the interests of ordinary people would drive policy, make all these huge seismic changes. And yet after all that, first off, it's the same 5 families running Britain who ran it in the 1500s. But second of all, the democratically elected prime minister cannot go for more than a week without reporting on their activities to the senior member of the Windsor family. Can't take office until they've sworn allegiance, fealty to the senior member of the Windsor family. We elect only 40% of our parliamentarians in Britain, and they can't take office until they've sworn obedience to the senior member of the Windsor family. Nothing can become law until the senior member of the Windsor family signs off on it. And we now know that Her late Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, blocked 160 pieces of legislation. They were not going to become law until she had obtained an exemption for her family and her properties. And so when in the 1960s, the Labour government decided it would be illegal to deny people jobs because of the colour of their skin, the Queen said, I'm not having that on any of my properties, and got an exemption. Workers' rights, as you rightly say, animal rights, no, not for royal properties. Not for royal properties. Thank you very much. So this is not ceremonial power. This is real political power after 800 years of trying to get rid of it and give those powers to Parliament. The Bible shows us that this is an old story, and how Yahweh behaves in the Yahweh stories is almost a template for how a royal family can behave and retain power even after they've been brought into a constitutional monarchy or a democracy or deposed or whatever it is. And I think these are lessons we need to be well up on in the 21st century, but that have been really painted over by this veneer of God story that's been pasted over the top.
Yeah, fascinating, isn't it? I was intrigued when you were talking about a conversation you had with some friends of yours who are pastors. You know, they have mega churches, etc. And when you said that every week you are contacted by pastors around the world who've reached similar conclusions that you're, sharing in your book, and who are now wrestling with how to carry that information in a community wedded to seemingly contrary beliefs. How many pastors know this information?
Oh, that's a very good question. I mean, in theory, any pastor with a theology degree would know what I am saying has credibility. Even if they don't want to agree with what I'm saying, they'll understand the theological footing for what I'm saying. Anyone who has a theological degree would know that the Bible stories of God are based on Sumerian stories of sky people, and that sky people is a Sumerian word for extraterrestrial. The problem is, first of all, a lot of pastors don't want to think about that, because when they're being exposed to that information, all they want is to get their degree so they can get on and be a pastor. That's their sense of calling, and they don't want anything really to derail their faith to too great an extent. So you've got that kind of personal dynamic going on. But then once you're out there, once you really have firmed up those conclusions, what do you do with that? If you're in a community that exists to perpetuate the familiar old stories, you are a very fortunate pastor indeed if you can begin to open these stories up without losing your job. So there's a conservatizing pressure right there. In academic circles, it's been known for 150 years that the Bible stories of God are based on Sumerian stories of sky people, but that just hasn't filtered down to the rank and file of the church membership. Now, there are pastors, I hear from youth pastors, senior pastors, retired pastors, who are wrestling with what I'm talking about. And they say, how do we begin to open this conversation up? They don't want to take the coward's route out and simply never talk about it. But they know if that all of a sudden on a Sunday morning they stand up and say, read Paul Wallis's book, I believe every word in it, that's going to be the end of their pastoral relationship with at least half their congregation. So there's actually not much point in their doing that. So how do they open the conversation up? And one of the things I suggest in the Eden Conspiracy is something that I've come to through my conversations with Mauro Bellino, who is a wonderful Italian Bible scholar.
To stop you there, Paul. We're about to run out of time. Could you condense that right down? Because it's such a cliffhanger.
Okay, so probably the best solution I offer in the Eden Conspiracy is to leave the key words untranslated. So Elohim, Yahweh, El Ba'adat, Kedi Mapasau, Kedi Mashatau, all those words, El Shaddai, El Elyon, Ruach, Kavod, leave them untranslated and let people see how they behave in the text. They'll be full of questions. And then when they come to you with their questions, just be honest or leave the questions hanging. When you preach on these texts, point out what's happening and say, now, what do you make of that? And leave the question hanging, because your people are intelligent enough to work out what's going on. It's all there in the Holy Bible. So just shine a little bit of light on those passages.
And we're going to have to leave our viewers hanging as well. We're going to have to do a follow-up to this, Paul. There's too much to share.
For sure.
For sure. Okay. Thank you for joining us today. We're almost out of time. The book is The Eden Conspiracy, Ancient Memories of ET Contact, 4th book in Paul's explosive Eden series. You've got to read them all. More information about Paul, go to paulanthonywallis.com, and you can watch more interviews and documentaries on the Fifth Kind TV channel on YouTube. That's it. We're out of time. Thanks for joining us today.